The crack of a gunshot echoed through the still morning air as Deborah Gray ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hadn't expected her journey to Concord, California, to be interrupted by the notorious Blackwater Gang, yet here she was, 22 years old and fighting for her life on the dusty trail just miles from her destination. It was 1875, and the promise of a new life teaching at the schoolhouse in Concord had lured Deborah away from her comfortable existence in Boston. The stagecoach had been making good time until the bandits appeared, seemingly from nowhere, their faces masked and guns drawn. "Get the woman," shouted the leader, a tall man with cold eyes visible through the slits in his bandana. "Leave no witnesses." Deborah glanced around desperately, watching as the stagecoach driver slumped forward, blood seeping through his shirt. The other passengers, 2 businessmen and an elderly woman, cowered inside the coach. "Run, miss," one of the businessmen called to her as she crouched behind the wheel. "Make for those trees." With trembling legs, Deborah gathered her skirts and bolted toward the tree line, the sound of hoofbeats close behind. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, her boots sliding in the loose dirt. The forest loomed ahead, promising shelter if she could just reach it. A strong hand grabbed her arm, yanking her backward. Deborah screamed, twisting in the grip of her captor. It was one of the bandits, his breath hot on her face as he laughed. "Got her, Sloan," he called over his shoulder. "Bring her," the leader, Sloan, ordered, dismounting from his horse. "She's seen our faces. Can't leave her to tell tales." "Please," Deborah begged, struggling against the iron grip. "I don't know who you are. I won't say anything." Sloan approached, removing his bandana to reveal a face marked by a jagged scar running from eye to lip. "Can't take that chance, miss. Besides, you might fetch a nice price where we're headed." With rough hands, they bound her wrists and threw her over the back of a horse. The last thing Deborah saw before they dragged her deeper into the woods was the stagecoach in flames, and the still bodies of her fellow travelers scattered on the ground. Miles away, at the Diamond H Ranch outside Concord, California, Ranger Holloway wiped the sweat from his brow as he hammered the last fence post into place. At 28, he'd built his ranch from nothing over the past 5 years, turning a wild plot of land into one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the area. His foreman, Joe Wilkins, rode up with a grim expression. Ranger stagecoach was hit about 10 miles east. Sheriff's gathering men to track the gang. Ranger dropped his hammer, his jaw tightening. "The Blackwater Gang again, looks like it. They're saying a young woman was taken. Schoolteacher headed for town." Something cold settled in Ranger's stomach. His sister had been taken by outlaws 3 years ago. They'd found her body 2 months later. He'd vowed never to let another innocent suffer such a fate if he could help it. "Saddle my horse," he said, already heading toward the house to gather his weapons. "And tell Miguel to ready 3 days' provisions." "You're going after them?" Joe asked, though he already knew the answer. "Someone has to," Ranger replied, his voice hard as the granite mountains that loomed in the distance. Within 20 minutes, Ranger was mounted on his stallion, Thunder, a Winchester rifle in his saddle holster and a Colt .45 at his hip. The sheriff and 5 other men were gathered at the edge of town, preparing to follow the bandits' trail. "Glad you're with us, Holloway," Sheriff Miller said as Ranger rode up. "You're the best tracker in 3 counties. Ranger nodded, his eyes already scanning the ground. "How long ago did it happen?" "About 3 hours. Got word from a traveler who saw the smoke." 3 hours is nothing," Ranger said, spurring Thunder forward. "Let's ride." The group followed the obvious trail eastward until they reached the burned-out stagecoach. Bodies had already been collected, but bloodstains darkened the dirt. Ranger dismounted, crouching to examine the tracks. 5 riders, he muttered, fingers tracing the hoofprints. 1 horse carrying double after the attack. He moved methodically, reading the story written in the soil. They headed north into the hills. He pointed toward the dense forest that covered the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Sheriff Miller frowned. "That's rough country. Could take weeks to find them if they're holed up there." "We don't have weeks," Ranger said, remounting Thunder. "The woman doesn't have weeks." As they followed the tracks into the forest, the sun began to sink behind the mountains. After several hours, they came to a creek where the tracks scattered. Clever, Ranger muttered. They rode through the water to mask their trail. The sheriff sighed, looking at his tired men. We should make camp, start fresh in the morning. Ranger shook his head. They won't stop. Neither should we. Be reasonable, Holloway. We can't track in the dark, and the men need rest. Ranger knew the sheriff was right, but every minute wasted meant the kidnappers got farther away. You make camp, I'm going ahead. Alone, that's suicide, son. I've been in worse spots, Ranger replied, checking his weapons. I know these hills better than most. I'll leave markers for you to follow at first light. Before anyone could argue further, Ranger urged Thunder across the creek. He had a feeling about which way the bandits had gone, and he wasn't about to let the trail grow cold. Deborah had never known such fear. The bandits had ridden hard through the day, stopping only to water their horses and force some jerky and water on her. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her body aching from being jolted across the saddle. As night fell, they made camp in a small clearing. Sloan ordered one of his men to untie her feet so she could walk, but her hands remained bound. Sit there, Sloan ordered, pointing to a fallen log. Try to run and I'll shoot you in the leg. Won't kill you, but you'll wish it had. Deborah believed him. She sat, watching as the men built a small fire and passed a bottle of whiskey between them. There were 5 in total. Sloan, the leader, a tall Mexican man they called Vicent, 2 brothers named Frank and Earl, and a younger man with nervous eyes who answered to Jed. What do you want with me? Deborah finally asked, her voice stronger than she felt. Sloan grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Plenty of men in the mining camps would pay good money for a pretty woman, especially one with education. Horror washed over her. I won't, you can't, we can do whatever we want, Sloan cut her off. You're far from civilization now, miss. Gray, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. Deborah Gray. Well, Miss Gray, you best get comfortable with your new circumstances. The man called Jed approached, offering her a tin cup of water. You should drink, he said quietly. Something in his eyes looked like pity, and Deborah seized on it. Help me, she whispered. Jed glanced nervously at Sloan, who was arguing with Vicent over something. I can't, he murmured. They'd kill me too. Please, Jed, Sloan barked. Get away from her, it's your watch first. Circle the camp, make sure we weren't followed. Jed jumped back, nodding quickly. Yes, sir. As the night deepened, the men took turns keeping watch while the others slept. Deborah couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. But even if she could slip her bonds, where would she go? She had no idea where she was or which direction would lead her to safety. She looked up at the stars visible through the canopy of trees, wondering if anyone was looking for her. Did anyone even know she was missing? Would the stagecoach company send word when she didn't arrive? Or would she simply disappear, another victim of the lawless frontier? Ranger Holloway moved through the forest with the confidence of a man who knew the land intimately. He'd hunted these hills for years, tracking deer and the occasional mountain lion. Human prey wasn't so different. They left signs, made mistakes. After crossing the creek, he'd found broken twigs and disturbed earth that suggested the bandits had headed northeast, toward an area known for abandoned mining claims and hidden valleys. Perfect hiding places for outlaws. He traveled through the night, stopping only when it became too dark to see the trail. Even then, he didn't make a proper camp, just tied Thunder to a tree and sat with his back against the trunk, rifle across his lap. He dozed lightly, waking at every sound. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, Ranger was already moving. The trail was faint but readable to his experienced eyes, a scuff mark here, a freshly broken branch there. By mid-morning, he caught the scent of wood smoke. Dismounting, Ranger secured Thunder and continued on foot. He moved silently, years of hunting making him nearly ghost-like as he approached the source of the smoke. From behind a large boulder, he surveyed the bandits' camp. 5 men, just as the tracks had indicated, and 1 woman bound and sitting against a tree. Her chestnut hair was disheveled, her blue dress torn and dirty, but even from this distance, Ranger could see she held herself with dignity. He assessed the situation carefully. The men were armed and the woman was in the middle of the camp. Any direct assault would put her in danger. He needed a plan. Ranger retreated to where he'd left Thunder and quickly formulated his strategy. He'd wait until nightfall when most of the men would be asleep. But first, he needed to leave markers for the sheriff and his posse, in case something went wrong. As the day progressed, Deborah tried to memorize her surroundings, looking for any opportunity to escape. The bandits seemed relaxed, confident they weren't being pursued. "We'll rest here today," Sloane announced after a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee. "Move on at dawn tomorrow." "Where are we going?" Vicent asked, cleaning his pistol. "North. I know a man in a mining camp near the Oregon border who'll pay top dollar for her." Deborah shuddered. Oregon was hundreds of miles away. With each passing hour, her chances of rescue diminished. By late afternoon, the monotony was broken by a distant sound, the baying of hounds. "Damn," Frank stood abruptly. "Those are tracking dogs." Sloane grabbed his rifle. "Pack up, now." He turned to Deborah, yanking her to her feet. "Make a sound and I'll cut your throat." The camp exploded into activity as the men hastily gathered their belongings. Deborah's heart raced. Someone was looking for her. "Jed, take her," Sloane ordered. "The rest of you spread out. We'll meet at Devil's Peak. Anyone gets caught, keep your mouth shut or I'll find you." Jed grabbed Deborah's arm, pulling her toward his horse. As he lifted her onto the saddle, she saw her chance. Taking a deep breath, she screamed as loudly as she could. Jed's hand clamped over her mouth, but it was too late. Her cry had pierced the forest silence. Sloane whirled, his face contorted with rage. "You stupid." He raised his hand to strike her, but a rifle shot cracked through the air, sending splinters flying from the tree beside Sloane's head. "Let her go," a deep voice commanded from the trees. Sloane ducked behind a boulder, raising his own rifle. "Who's there?" "Your worst nightmare if you don't release that woman," came the reply. Deborah's heart leapt. A rescuer. But as gunfire erupted around her, she realized she was caught in the middle of a deadly firefight. Ranger fired methodically, moving from tree to create the illusion of multiple attackers. It was a risky gambit, but he needed the bandits to believe they were outnumbered. He watched as they scattered for cover, the young one dragging the woman with him. Ranger took careful aim and fired, the bullet grazing the young bandit's shoulder. The man yelped, releasing his grip on the woman. "Run," Ranger shouted to her. "This way." Deborah hesitated only a moment before scrambling toward the voice, keeping low as bullets whizzed overhead. She spotted a man motioning to her from behind a large pine tree and made a desperate dash toward him. A bullet kicked up dirt at her feet, but she didn't stop. With a final burst of speed, she reached the shelter of the tree, collapsing against the solid form of her rescuer. "Stay down," he instructed, his voice surprisingly gentle despite the chaos. He quickly cut her bonds with a hunting knife, his eyes an intense blue, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No," Deborah gasped, rubbing her raw wrists. "Just scared." "I'm Ranger Holloway." "Sheriff's about half a day behind us with reinforcements." "Deborah Gray, thank you for coming after me." A bullet splintered the bark above their heads, and Ranger pulled her closer, shielding her with his body. The solid warmth of him made Deborah feel safe for the first time since the attack. "We need to move," he said, firing a return shot. "My horse is about a quarter-mile back. Can you run?" Deborah nodded, gathering her torn skirts. "I'll try. On my signal, head that way," Ranger pointed. "I'll cover you." He fired several rapid shots, emptying his rifle. "Now." Deborah ran, her heart pounding in her ears. Behind her, she heard Ranger firing his pistol, keeping the bandits pinned down. Branches whipped at her face, but she didn't slow, following the direction he'd indicated. After what seemed like an eternity, she spotted a magnificent black stallion tethered to a tree. She reached the horse just as Ranger caught up to her, holstering his pistol. "They'll be right behind us," he said, untying the horse. "Can you ride?" "Yes, I grew up riding in Vermont." Ranger nodded, helping her onto Thunder's back before swinging up behind her. One arm circled her waist, holding her securely as he urged the horse forward. "Hold tight," he said, his breath warm against her ear. Thunder surged forward, powerful muscles bunching as he navigated the forest terrain. Deborah gripped the saddle horn, acutely aware of the strong arm around her waist and the solid chest at her back. They rode hard for several miles, Ranger occasionally glancing back to check for pursuit. Finally, as Thunder began to tire, they slowed to a walk. "I think we've lost them for now," Ranger said, "but they won't give up easily." Who are they? Deborah asked, still breathless from their escape. The Blackwater Gang. They've been terrorizing this part of California for months. Stage robberies, kidnappings, murder. They were going to sell me, Deborah said, her voice breaking. At a mining camp. Ranger's arm tightened around her waist briefly. That's not going to happen now. As the adrenaline of escape faded, exhaustion swept over Deborah. She found herself leaning back against Ranger's chest, her eyes growing heavy despite the danger. Rest if you can, he said softly. We have a long ride ahead of us. Secure in his embrace, Deborah allowed herself to drift into an uneasy sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the reassuring presence of the man who had risked his life to save her. Ranger felt the exact moment when Deborah Gray surrendered to exhaustion, her body relaxing against his. He adjusted his hold, making sure she wouldn't slip from the saddle. She was smaller than he'd initially thought, delicate even, though she'd shown remarkable courage during their escape. He guided Thunder toward a creek he knew ran through these hills, planning to follow it downstream to make their trail harder to track. The Blackwater Gang wouldn't give up easily, not after having a valuable prize snatched from their grasp. As they rode, Ranger considered their options. The nearest town was Concord, but that was at least 2 days' ride given their current situation. They'd need to find shelter for the night, somewhere defensible where he could protect Deborah if the gang caught up to them. By late afternoon, Thunder was showing signs of fatigue. They'd covered nearly 15 miles of rough terrain, and even the powerful stallion had limits. Ahead, Ranger spotted what he was looking for: an abandoned trapper's cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. He discovered the place years ago while hunting. It wasn't much: a single room with a stone fireplace and a crude bunk, but it had thick walls and only one door to defend. Most importantly, it was positioned with its back to a cliff, eliminating the possibility of attack from behind. "Miss Gray," he said softly, reluctant to wake her but needing her alert as they approached the cabin. "Deborah." She stirred, momentarily confused before tensing as memory returned. "Are they following us?" "Not that I can tell, but we need to stop for the night." "There's a cabin just ahead where we can rest." She straightened, putting a small distance between them, and Ranger immediately missed her warmth. "Is it safe?" "Safer than being in the open," he replied honestly. "I know these hills. If they come, we'll hear them." The cabin was dusty but intact. Ranger helped Deborah dismount, steadying her when her legs buckled from exhaustion and hours in the saddle. "Sorry," she murmured, her cheeks flushing. "No need to apologize," Ranger said, keeping a supportive hand at her elbow as he led her inside. "You've been through hell today." While Deborah sat on the cabin's only chair, Ranger cared for Thunder, removing his saddle and brushing him down before securing him at the side of the cabin where grass grew in abundance. He gathered firewood, filled their canteens from the nearby creek, and checked the perimeter before returning inside. Deborah had used his absence to attempt to tidy herself. She'd washed her face with water from the cabin's rain barrel and arranged her torn dress as best she could. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a simple braid, revealing a face that, despite the ordeal, was strikingly beautiful. "You should eat something," Ranger said, setting his saddlebags on the rough-hewn table. He pulled out jerky, hardtack, and a small pouch of dried fruit. "Thank you," Deborah said, accepting the food with trembling hands, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Ranger busied himself building a fire, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same, but they didn't. You did." She watched him work, her green eyes reflecting the growing flames. "How did you find me?" "Tracked you," he said simply. "I was with the sheriff's posse, but decided to go ahead when they wanted to make camp. You risked your life for a stranger." Ranger paused, memories of his sister surfacing. 3 years ago, my sister was taken by outlaws by the time we found her." He shook his head, unable to finish. Understanding dawned in Deborah's eyes. "I'm so sorry." Ranger nodded once, accepting her sympathy but unwilling to dwell on the past. "The sheriff and his men will be following our trail. They should reach us by tomorrow afternoon, then we'll get you safely to Concord." "That's where I was headed," Deborah said. "I'm to be the new schoolteacher." Ranger looked up in surprise. "My ranch is just outside Concord, the Diamond H." A small smile curved her lips. What a coincidence. A fortunate one, Ranger agreed, finding himself returning her smile. There was something about Deborah Gray that drew him in, despite his usual reserve around strangers. As they ate their simple meal, Deborah told him about her journey from Boston, her teaching experience, and her hopes for her new position. Ranger found himself sharing stories of his ranch, the challenges and rewards of building something from nothing. "You should try to get some sleep," he said eventually, noticing her eyelids drooping despite her evident interest in their conversation. "Take the bunk, I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," she protested. "I'm used to long nights," he assured her. "I'll wake you if there's trouble." Deborah hesitated but finally nodded, too exhausted to argue further. She settled onto the narrow bunk, pulling Ranger's spare blanket around her shoulders. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep. Ranger positioned himself by the window, rifle across his knees. The night was quiet, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. But he remained vigilant, knowing the Blackwater Gang wouldn't abandon their pursuit easily. As he watched over Deborah's sleeping form, something stirred in his chest, a protectiveness that went beyond duty or obligation. There was a strength in her that he admired, a resilience that matched his own. For the first time since his sister's death, Ranger Holloway felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. Dawn broke with mist clinging to the trees, casting the forest in an ethereal light. Deborah woke to find Ranger still at his post, his expression alert despite his night-long vigil. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, sitting up and smoothing her rumpled skirts. "Enough," he replied, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "No sign of trouble. The sheriff's men should be here soon," Ranger nodded. "If they followed my markers, they'll find us by midday." Deborah stood, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Yesterday's terror and flight had left her body bruised and aching, but she was determined not to show weakness. "What can I do to help?" Ranger's expression softened. "There's a creek about 50 yards east if you want to freshen up." "I'll keep watch from here." Grateful for the opportunity to wash away some of the previous day's grime, Deborah took a small bar of soap Ranger offered from his saddlebags and made her way to the creek. The water was icy, but refreshing as she washed her face and hands, trying to restore some semblance of dignity to her appearance. When she returned, Ranger had a small fire going and coffee brewing in a battered tin pot. "It's not Boston's finest," he said apologetically, handing her a cup. "It's perfect," she replied, warming her hands on the cup. The strong, bitter brew revived her spirits, as did the morning's peace. Ranger seemed different in the daylight, less the grim rescuer, and more a man of quiet strength. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of comfort in his own skin, confident but not arrogant. "Tell me about your ranch," Deborah said, curious about the life he'd built. A genuine smile transformed his face. "It's not much compared to the big spreads further south, but it's mine. Started with 20 acres and a dozen head of cattle. Now it's 500 acres and nearly 200 head." "That's impressive," Deborah said. "You did that alone." "Had help. My foreman, Joe Wilkins, has been with me from the start. Good man, and I hire hands for the busier seasons." He paused, looking at her curiously. "What made you decide to become a teacher?" "My father was a professor at Harvard. He believed education was the greatest gift one could give or receive." A shadow crossed her face. "After he died, I knew I wanted to carry on his legacy, but Boston had plenty of teachers. I thought I might make more of a difference out west." "Concord will be lucky to have you," Ranger said, his eyes holding hers for a moment before he looked away, attending to the fire. The morning passed quietly as they waited for the sheriff's posse. Ranger taught Deborah how to identify different animal tracks in the soft earth around the cabin, and she showed him a simple card trick her father had taught her, using a deck Ranger had in his saddlebags. It was strange, Deborah thought, how comfortable she felt with this man she'd known for less than a day. Perhaps it was the intensity of their shared experience, or simply his unassuming kindness, but she found herself laughing more easily than she had in months. Their companionable morning was shattered by the distant crack of a rifle shot. Ranger was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the fire with dirt and grabbing his rifle. "Get inside," he ordered, all trace of relaxation gone from his face. Deborah hurried into the cabin, heart racing as Ranger followed, barring the door behind them. "The sheriff?" she asked hopefully. Ranger shook his head, peering through a crack in the shutters. Sheriff would announce himself, and that shot came from the north opposite direction from town. "The Blackwater Gang," Deborah whispered, fear coiling in her stomach. "Stay away from the windows," Ranger instructed, his voice calm despite the danger. "They're trying to flush us out, see if anyone's here." Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by a man's voice. "We know you're in there, Holloway. Send out the woman and we'll let you live." It was Sloan. Deborah recognized his voice immediately and a shudder ran through her. "Like hell," Ranger muttered, checking his ammunition. He turned to Deborah, his expression grave. "I count 3 of them from what I can see. They've got us surrounded on 3 sides." "What do we do?" Deborah asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Wait them out. Sheriff's men can't be far." He hesitated, then added, "If something happens to me, there's a trapdoor under the bunk. It leads to a root cellar. Stay hidden until help comes." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Deborah said firmly, refusing to contemplate that possibility. A smile flickered across Ranger's face. "I like your confidence, Miss Gray. You have 1 minute, Holloway," Sloan shouted. "Then we start shooting." Ranger positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. "When the shooting starts, get down behind the table. Its thick oak should stop most bullets." Deborah nodded, her throat dry. Just yesterday, she'd been a proper Boston schoolteacher headed for her new post. Now she was in a standoff with outlaws, placing her life in the hands of a man she barely knew yet trusted completely. "Time's up," Sloan called, followed immediately by a volley of gunfire that shattered the cabin's windows and thudded into the walls. Ranger returned fire methodically, each shot precise. "2 on the left, 1 on the right," he reported as Deborah crouched behind the table. "They're keeping their distance, using the trees for cover." The exchange of gunfire continued for what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes. Ranger was conservative with his ammunition, firing only when he had a clear shot. Twice, Deborah heard cries of pain from outside, suggesting his bullets had found their targets. "I got one," Ranger said grimly, "but they're closing in." A bullet splintered the door, sending wood chips flying. Another crashed through the remaining window, embedding itself in the far wall. The cabin, which had seemed so secure earlier, now felt like a trap. Suddenly, there was a lull in the shooting. Deborah raised her head cautiously, meeting Ranger's worried gaze. "They're up to something," he whispered. A moment later, the smell of smoke reached them. "Fire," Deborah gasped, seeing tendrils of smoke seeping through the walls. Ranger cursed, moving quickly to the door to peer through a crack. "They've set the north side alight, winds in their favor." The smoke thickened rapidly, filling the cabin with its acrid scent. Deborah covered her mouth with her sleeve, eyes watering. "We have to get out," Ranger said, coughing. "The root cellar connects to a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. It's our only chance." He helped Deborah drag the bunk aside, revealing a trapdoor in the rough floorboards. As he lifted it, cooler air wafted up from below. "You go first," he said, taking a final look through the window. "I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow." "I'm not leaving without you," Deborah insisted, gripping his arm. Their eyes met in the smoke-filled cabin, and something passed between them, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Together, then," Ranger conceded, but quickly. He helped her down into the narrow space below, then followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind them. The root cellar was little more than a dugout under the cabin, but it led to a roughly hewn tunnel presumably dug by the original trapper for emergency escapes. They crawled through the confined space, the sounds of gunfire and the crackling of flames growing distant. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Ranger's shoulders, and so low they had to move on hands and knees. Dirt crumbled from the ceiling with each movement, and roots dangled in their faces. After what seemed an eternity, they emerged into a dry creek bed, concealed from view by dense underbrush. Ranger immediately pulled Deborah behind a large boulder, scanning the surroundings for danger. "The cabin's fully engulfed," he whispered, pointing to where smoke billowed above the tree line. "They'll think we're still inside." What about Thunder? Deborah asked, remembering the loyal stallion. I released him when the shooting started. He'll head home if he can. Ranger checked his pistol, the only weapon he'd been able to bring through the tunnel. We need to move. The creek bed leads east. If we follow it, we can circle back toward Concord. They moved cautiously, staying low and using the creek's bank for cover. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, but Ranger remained vigilant, frequently stopping to listen and check for tracks. As they traveled, dark clouds gathered overhead, and the air grew heavy with approaching rain. By mid-afternoon, the first drops began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour that soaked them to the skin, but also washed away any trail they might have left. We need shelter, Ranger said finally, noting Deborah's shivering despite her attempts to hide it. The rain had plastered her dress to her slender form, and her braid hung like a sodden rope down her back. Yet she hadn't complained once, matching his pace without hesitation. There, he pointed to a rocky overhang about 50 yards ahead. It's not much, but it'll keep the rain off. The small cave was dry and, more importantly, defensible, with a clear view of the surrounding area. Ranger gathered what dry wood he could find beneath nearby trees, and soon had a small fire going just inside the entrance. Deborah huddled near the flames, wringing water from her skirts. Do you think they're still looking for us? Probably, Ranger admitted. But this rain is a blessing. It'll hide our tracks and make it nearly impossible for them to find us. And the sheriff's men? Same problem, but they'll keep searching, especially once they find the burned cabin. Deborah nodded, falling silent as she stared into the flames. The events of the past 2 days seemed surreal, like something from one of the dime novels she occasionally indulged in back in Boston. Except this was real, with real danger and real consequences. You're remarkable, you know, Ranger said suddenly. Startled, Deborah looked up to find his blue eyes studying her with admiration. What do you mean? Most city women would be hysterical after what you've been through. You've handled it with more courage than many men I know. A flush that had nothing to do with the fire spread across Deborah's cheeks. I don't feel very brave. I'm terrified. Courage isn't about not feeling fear, Ranger said quietly. It's about facing it. Something in his voice made Deborah look at him more closely. Beyond the strong jaw and whether tanned skin was a man who understood loss and fear intimately, she wondered what other tragedies had shaped him besides his sister's death. What was her name? Deborah asked softly. Your sister. Ranger's expression tightened briefly before answering. Rebecca. She was 20 when they took her. Bright, full of life, wanted to be a doctor. I'm so sorry, he nodded, accepting her sympathy without comment. After a moment he asked, do you have family back in Boston? Just my mother and younger brother. My father died 2 years ago, heart failure. Deborah smiled sadly. Mother didn't want me coming west, said it was no place for a lady. She might have been right, Ranger said, but there was a teasing note in his voice that lightened the mood. Deborah laughed softly. Perhaps, but I've always been stubborn. She hesitated, then added, and I needed to make my own way. After Father died, everything changed. Our house felt suffocating. Ranger nodded in understanding. That's why I came west too. After the war, Virginia felt too small, too full of ghosts. You fought in the war between the states. Union cavalry. Joined when I was 18, fought until Appomattox. His expression grew distant. Saw things no young man should see. The rain continued to fall as they talked, sharing pieces of their pasts that shaped who they'd become. Deborah learned that Ranger had worked as a guide for settlers before saving enough to buy his land. She told him about her teaching in Boston, her love of literature, and her dreams of starting a proper school in Concord. As night fell, the rain finally stopped, leaving a mist-shrouded forest and a sky full of stars visible through breaks in the clouds. We should rest, Ranger said, adding more wood to the fire. It's at least another day's walk to Concord, even if we don't run into trouble. Deborah nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Every muscle ached, and the events of the day had drained her completely. I'll take first watch, Ranger continued, settling himself near the cave entrance where he could see anyone approaching. Try to sleep. Deborah curled up on her side near the fire, using her arm as a pillow. Despite her discomfort, sleep claimed her almost immediately, Sometime later, she awoke to find Ranger's coat draped over her. He sat in the same position, silhouetted against the night sky, his profile strong and watchful. "You should sleep too," she murmured, sitting up. He turned, surprise evident in his face. "Thought you were out for the night." "I'm not used to sleeping on stone floors," she said with a small smile, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. It smelled of leather, wood smoke, and something distinctly him. "Please rest, I can keep watch." Ranger hesitated, clearly torn between exhaustion and duty. "Wake me if you hear anything, anything at all. I promise." He stretched out by the fire, using his saddle bags as a pillow, and was asleep within moments. In repose, his face looked younger, the lines of worry smoothed away. Deborah found herself studying him, the strong jaw covered in stubble, the long lashes resting against his cheeks, the small scar at his temple that she hadn't noticed before. A strange feeling washed over her, something between tenderness and admiration. This man had risked everything for a stranger, had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. In Boston, she'd received attention from men before, mostly fellow teachers or her father's colleagues, but none had stirred in her the feelings that Ranger Holloway did. It was foolish, of course. They barely knew each other, and these feelings were likely just a product of their intense circumstances. Once they reached Concord and life returned to normal, whatever this was would fade. Yet as she watched over him through the quiet night, listening to his steady breathing and the occasional pop of the fire, Deborah wondered if anything would ever feel normal again. Morning arrived with birdsong and mist rising from the damp earth. Ranger woke alert and ready, showing no signs of having slept on hard ground. He insisted on checking the surrounding area before they set off, making sure the Blackwater Gang hadn't somehow tracked them during the night. "All clear," he reported, returning to their makeshift camp. "We should reach the main trail to Concord by nightfall if we make good time." They breakfasted on the last of Ranger's provisions, jerky and dried fruit, before setting out. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, droplets of water clinging to leaves and sparkling like diamonds. Under different circumstances, Deborah might have found it enchanting. As they walked, Ranger taught her how to move quietly through the underbrush, how to spot game trails, and how to find north without a compass. Deborah absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions that made him smile at her curiosity. "You're a quick study," he commented as she successfully identified deer tracks in a patch of mud. "I've always loved learning new things," she replied. "Though I admit tracking outlaws wasn't on my list of skills to acquire." Ranger chuckled, a warm sound that Deborah decided she wanted to hear more often. "Hopefully it's a skill you won't need again after today." They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest gradually thinned as they descended toward the valley where Concord lay. "Tell me about the town," Deborah said. "What are the people like?" "Good folks, mostly. Hard-working. The town's been growing steadily since the railroad came through. There's a general store, a hotel, couple of saloons, though I imagine those won't be on your regular visits." He glanced at her with amusement. The previous schoolteacher was Miss Harrington, an older lady who ran that school like a military academy. "The children will probably be in shock when they meet you." "Why is that?" Deborah asked. "You're young, pretty, and from what I can tell, don't carry a hickory switch everywhere you go." Deborah laughed, pleased by the casual compliment. "I believe discipline is important, but fear isn't the best teacher. The school board might disagree, but the children will love you for it." As they continued, Ranger pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history. It was a side of him Deborah hadn't seen before, more relaxed, almost playful at times. She found herself hoping this wouldn't be the end of their acquaintance once they reached town. By mid-afternoon, they had covered significant ground. The terrain had become easier, with established game trails to follow instead of pushing through dense underbrush. Ranger estimated they were only about 5 miles from the main road to Concord. They stopped by a small stream to rest and refill their canteens. As Deborah knelt by the water, a movement in the trees across the stream caught her eye. "Ranger," she said quietly, not moving. He was beside her instantly, one hand going to his pistol. "What is it, there in those trees?" Something moved. Ranger scanned the area carefully, his body tense. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a deer stepped cautiously from the forest, its ears flicking nervously as it approached the stream. Deborah exhaled in relief. Just a deer. But Ranger remained vigilant, his eyes narrowing as he continued to study the tree line. Maybe, he murmured. The deer suddenly raised its head, alert to some danger they couldn't perceive. It bounded away in a flash of white tail. "Run," Ranger said urgently, pulling Deborah to her feet. Now, they had barely moved when a rifle shot shattered the peace, sending birds scattering from the trees. Deborah felt something tug at her sleeve as Ranger yanked her behind a large tree. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his eyes frantically searching her for injury. "No, I don't think so," she gasped, heart racing. Another shot splintered bark near their heads. Ranger returned fire, his face grim. "It's them, must have found our trail after the rain stopped." "What do we do?" "Make for that ridge," he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards away. "I'll cover you." Before she could protest, he stepped out from behind the tree, firing rapidly to draw attention away from her. Deborah gathered her skirts and ran, zigzagging as Ranger had taught her. Bullets kicked up dirt at her feet, but she didn't stop until she reached the shelter of the rocks. Ranger was right behind her, ducking as a bullet whined off the stone above his head. "Keep going," he urged. "Up and over." They scrambled up the rocky slope, using the boulders for cover as bullets continued to strike around them. Reaching the top, they found themselves looking down into a steep ravine. "We have to cross it," Ranger said, assessing the situation quickly. "The main road is just beyond those trees on the other side." The ravine was about 30 feet across with a small stream at the bottom. The descent looked treacherous, loose shale and few handholds. "I'll go first," Ranger decided, holstering his pistol. "Follow exactly where I step." He began making his way down, testing each foothold before committing his weight. Deborah followed carefully, her skirts hampering her movements. Above them, voices shouted as their pursuers reached the ridge. "Hurry," Ranger called, extending his hand to help her over a particularly steep section. They were halfway across the ravine when the first bullets began raining down. A chunk of rock exploded near Deborah's hand, sending sharp fragments into her palm. She cried out, nearly losing her balance. "Almost there," Ranger encouraged, steadying her with a firm grip. "Just a little further." They reached the stream at the bottom, wading through the ankle-deep water to the other side. The climb up was even more difficult, with fewer handholds and steeper terrain. Deborah's dress was torn and muddy, her hands bleeding from cuts and scrapes, but she pushed on. Driven by the sound of their pursuers descending into the ravine behind them, Ranger reached the top first, turning to pull Deborah up the last few feet. As she scrambled over the edge, a bullet struck the ground inches from her foot. Ranger dragged her behind a fallen log, both of them breathing heavily. "The road can't be far," he said between breaths. "If we can reach it, we might find help." He peered over the log, assessing their situation. "Two of them in the ravine. Don't see Sloan, but he must be close." As if summoned by his name, Sloan's voice called from somewhere to their right. "Give it up, Holloway. You're outnumbered and outgunned." "Like hell," Ranger muttered. To Deborah, he said, "When I start shooting, run straight ahead through those trees. Don't stop until you hit the road. If you find help, bring them back. If not, keep going to Concord." "I'm not leaving you," Deborah insisted, the thought of abandoning him unthinkable. "One of us needs to get through," Ranger argued. "You're faster without me slowing you down to protect you." "But please, Deborah." His use of her first name, spoken with such intensity, silenced her protests. "I'll be right behind you, I promise." Before she could respond, he rose slightly and fired several shots in quick succession. "Now, go." Hard in her throat, Deborah ran. She pushed through underbrush and dodged trees, her focus solely on the path ahead. Gunfire erupted behind her, but she didn't look back, praying that Ranger would keep his promise. The trees began to thin, and suddenly, there it was, a wide dirt road rutted with wagon wheels. Deborah burst from the forest, nearly collapsing with relief. To her astonishment, a group of riders was approaching from the direction of Concord. As they drew closer, she saw the glint of badges on several chests. "Help," she shouted, waving her arms. "Please help us." The riders spurred their horses forward. In the lead was an older man with a silver mustache and the stern demeanor of authority, the sheriff, she guessed. "Miss Gray," he called as they reached her. "Yes, how did you know? Been looking for you for 2 days. Holloway with you." "He's back there," she pointed frantically toward the woods. "The Blackwater Gang found us. They're shooting at him." Without hesitation, the sheriff barked orders to his men, most dismounted, drawing weapons as they advanced toward the forest. 2 stayed with Deborah, one offering her his canteen. "Ranger said you'd be following us," she said between gulps of water. "How did you know where to find us?" "Found the burned-out cabin yesterday," the deputy explained. "Tracked you as best we could after the rain. Then this morning Holloway's horse showed up in town, figured you couldn't be far." Relief washed over Deborah. Thunder had made it home safely. Gunfire erupted from the forest, several shots in rapid succession, then silence. Deborah held her breath, staring at the tree line with growing dread. The minutes stretched endlessly as she waited for some sign, some indication of what was happening. Finally, figures emerged from the trees. She recognized Sheriff Miller first, then 2 deputies supporting a limping figure between them. "Ranger," Deborah cried, running toward him. His face was streaked with dirt and blood from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. He looked up at her call, his eyes lighting with relief. "You made it," he said as she reached him. "Of course I did. You told me to run, remember?" She wanted to throw her arms around him but restrained herself, conscious of the deputies and sheriff watching. "Sloan," she asked, suddenly remembering their chief pursuer. "Dead," the sheriff answered grimly. "Took a bullet trying to circle around behind Holloway here. The other 2 surrendered." Deborah sagged with relief. It was over. They were safe. One of the deputies helped Ranger onto his horse and another offered his mount to Deborah. As they began the journey to Concord, Ranger rode beside her, his presence a comfort despite his battered condition. "Quite the introduction to frontier life," he commented wryly. "Not exactly what you expected when you left Boston, I imagine." Deborah laughed, the sound surprising her after the tension of the past days. "No, not quite, though I must say the company has been educational." A smile tugged at Ranger's lips. "Glad to be of service, Miss Gray." Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary, and Deborah felt that same strange flutter in her chest she'd experienced in the cave. Whatever was growing between them, it hadn't been just a product of their desperate circumstances. As they crested a hill, Concord came into view below them, a neat collection of buildings nestled in the valley, with farms and ranches dotting the surrounding countryside. It looked peaceful, welcoming. "Welcome to your new home," Ranger said softly. Deborah smiled, suddenly eager to begin this new chapter of her life. A chapter that, she hoped, would include the remarkable man riding beside her. The town of Concord buzzed with excitement as the sheriff's posse rode down Main Street with Deborah and Ranger in their midst. News of the stagecoach robbery and kidnapping had spread quickly, and it seemed the entire population had turned out to witness their return. Deborah felt self-conscious in her torn and dirty dress, her hair a tangled mess despite her best efforts to tidy it. But the warm welcome from the townspeople, complete strangers calling her name and expressing relief at her safety, touched her deeply. Dr. Wilson, the town physician, insisted on examining both of them immediately. Ranger's injuries proved superficial cuts, bruises, and a sprained ankle from the scramble through the ravine. Deborah had fared slightly better, with only minor cuts on her hands and a few bruises. "You both need rest," the doctor pronounced sternly, "and plenty of it." Mrs. Peterson, the mayor's wife, took charge of Deborah, whisking her away to the Peterson home with promises of hot baths, clean clothes, and proper meals. Ranger was similarly commandeered by the sheriff, who insisted he stay at his house until fully recovered. Before they parted, Ranger caught Deborah's hand. "I'll call on you tomorrow if you're feeling up to visitors." "I'd like that," she replied, reluctant to leave his side after all they'd been through together. Mrs. Peterson proved to be a motherly woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner that brooked no argument. She ran a hot bath for Deborah, provided a nightgown and robe that had belonged to her daughter, and served a meal that would have fed 3 people. "You poor dear," she clucked as Deborah sank gratefully into the steaming water. What a terrible ordeal. But Ranger Holloway, now there's a man worth getting kidnapped for, if you don't mind my saying so. Deborah blushed. He saved my life. Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled knowingly. And from the way he looked at you in town, I'd say he'd do it again in a heartbeat. Too exhausted to analyze the comment, Deborah allowed herself to be bundled into bed after her bath and meal. She fell asleep instantly, dreaming of blue eyes and strong hands guiding her through dark forests. The next morning, she awoke feeling remarkably restored. Mrs. Peterson had laid out a simple but pretty blue dress, another loan from her daughter, who now lived in Sacramento, and helped Deborah style her hair. The school board wants to meet with you this afternoon, Mrs. Peterson informed her over breakfast. Just a formality, mind you. Your position is secure. They're just eager to meet the brave young woman everyone's talking about. Everyone's talking about me, Deborah asked, dismayed. Of course, dear. It's the most exciting thing to happen in Concord since the Jameson twins were born with 6 toes each. Mrs. Peterson patted her hand. Don't worry, it's all admiration, I assure you. After breakfast, Mrs. Peterson took Deborah shopping to replace some of the belongings lost in the stagecoach robbery. The town's general store was well stocked, and the owner, Mr. Fleming, insisted on giving her a discount on everything. Least I can do for our new schoolteacher, he said warmly. My 3 youngest will be in your class come fall. As promised, Ranger called that afternoon. Deborah was in the parlor reviewing some notes for her meeting with the school board when Mrs. Peterson showed him in. He looked different in town clothes, a clean white shirt, dark vest, and pressed trousers. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd shaved the stubble that had covered his jaw during their ordeal, but his eyes were the same intense blue, lighting with pleasure when they fell on her. Miss Gray, he said, hat in hand, you're looking well. Mr. Holloway, she returned formally, conscious of Mrs. Peterson hovering nearby. I'm glad to see you recovered. An awkward silence fell between them, so different from the easy companionship they'd shared in the wilderness. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the tension, excused herself to prepare tea, though Deborah suspected it was merely a pretext to give them privacy. As soon as they were alone, Ranger moved closer. How are you really? Better than I expected, Deborah admitted, though I keep startling at loud noises. He nodded in understanding. That will pass with time. The sheriff told me they've identified the other members of the gang. They'll stand trial next month. Good. Ranger's expression hardened briefly before softening as he looked at her. I rode out to the stagecoach site this morning. They've buried the victims, but I found this among the wreckage. He held out a small, slightly scorched book. Deborah gasped, recognizing her copy of Emerson's essays, a gift from her father that she had believed lost forever. How did you know it was mine? She asked, taking the book reverently. Your name is inside the cover, he replied with a small smile, and it seemed like something you'd value. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Deborah impulsively reached for his hand. Thank you for this and for everything. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. I'm just glad you're safe. They stood that way for a long moment, neither willing to break the connection. In his eyes, Deborah saw the same emotions that had been growing in her heart: affection, admiration, and something deeper, something with the potential to become much more, the sound of Mrs. Peterson returning with the tea tray forced them to step apart. The older woman's knowing smile suggested she'd witnessed their closeness, but approved. Over tea, Ranger told Deborah about the arrangements for her new position. The schoolhouse was on the edge of town, with a small attached residence for the teacher. Classes wouldn't begin for another month, giving her time to settle in and prepare. My ranch is only 3 miles from the schoolhouse, he mentioned casually. Northwest, toward the foothills. Is that an invitation to visit Mr. Holloway? Deborah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. A slow smile spread across his face. It most certainly is, Miss Gray. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Deborah settled into her new life in Concord. The townspeople welcomed her warmly, eager to meet the young woman who had survived such a harrowing adventure. Her story had grown with each telling, until one might have thought she'd single-handedly fought off a dozen outlaws. The schoolhouse was simple but well-maintained, with rows of wooden desks facing a blackboard and a pot-bellied stove for winter heating. The attached living quarters were modest: a bedroom, small sitting room, and kitchen, but after sharing a cramped Boston apartment with her mother and brother, Deborah found them spacious. She spent her days organizing the schoolroom, reviewing texts, and creating lesson plans for her future students. In the evenings, she often found herself accepting dinner invitations from various families eager to introduce themselves and their children. Throughout it all, Ranger was a constant presence. He rode into town frequently, ostensibly on ranch business, but always finding time to call on her. Their relationship evolved naturally from rescuer and rescued to friends and, increasingly, something more. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ranger invited Deborah to visit the Diamond H Ranch. Mrs. Peterson insisted on accompanying her as chaperone for propriety's sake. Dear, but tactfully occupied herself with Ranger's housekeeper while he showed Deborah around the property. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with bookcases that surprised and delighted her. "You're a reader," she observed, examining titles that ranged from practical manuals on animal husbandry to classics like the Iliad and Shakespeare's plays. "My father was a teacher before the war," Ranger explained. "He believed education shouldn't stop when schooling ends." Outside, he showed her the barns, corrals, and the spring-fed stream that provided water for the property. His pride in what he'd built was evident in every word, every gesture. "It's wonderful," Deborah said sincerely as they stood on a hill overlooking the ranch. "You've created something truly special here." Ranger looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's missing something important." "What's that?" "A family to share it with." The words hung between them, laden with meaning. Deborah's breath caught as Ranger took her hand, his touch sending warmth through her despite the cool autumn air. "I know it's sudden," he said quietly. "We've known each other less than a month. But when you've faced death together, you learn quickly what matters." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I care for you, Deborah, more than I thought possible after knowing someone such a short time." "I feel the same," she admitted, her heart racing. "It doesn't make sense, but—" "Does it have to?" He stepped closer, still holding her hand. "Some things just are." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, a perfect rightness that defied explanation. His lips were gentle against hers, one hand cradling her cheek as if she were something precious. They broke apart at the sound of Mrs. Peterson calling from the house. Deborah blushed, but Ranger merely smiled, keeping hold of her hand as they walked back. "I should speak to the sheriff," he murmured. "As your unofficial guardian in town, he should be consulted." "About what?" Deborah asked innocently, though she knew perfectly well what he meant. Ranger's eyes crinkled with amusement. "About my intentions to court you properly, Miss Gray, if you're amenable, of course." "I believe I could be persuaded," she replied, squeezing his hand. The courtship that followed was the talk of Concord. Ranger called at the schoolhouse regularly, bringing small gifts: a book of poetry, wildflowers from the hills, a handcrafted wooden box for her desk. They attended church together on Sundays, dined with various townspeople, and occasionally rode out to the ranch for picnics, always properly chaperoned. As September arrived, bringing with it the start of the school term, Deborah found herself busier than ever. 28 children, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, filled her classroom. Teaching them was challenging but deeply satisfying, especially as she watched their initial wariness give way to enthusiasm. "You're a natural teacher," Ranger observed one evening as he walked her home after dinner at the hotel. "Those children adore you. Even Billy Taylor," Deborah laughed, referring to the mischievous 12-year-old who had already earned a reputation as the class troublemaker. "Especially Billy. I saw him defending you to his older brother yesterday. Said you were the smartest lady he'd ever met." They reached the schoolhouse, pausing at the steps to her quarters. In the moonlight, Ranger's face was cast in silver and shadow, his eyes dark and serious as he looked down at her. "Deborah," he began, taking both her hands in his, "these past weeks have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," she said softly. I know it hasn't been long, but I've never been more certain of anything." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I think I started falling for you that first day, watching you show such courage in the face of danger." Tears pricked at Deborah's eyes. "I love you too. It seems impossible that so much could change in so short a time, but—" "When you know," he finished for her, echoing what he'd said at the ranch. Then, to her surprise, he knelt before her, still holding her hands. "Deborah Gray, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life." Joy unlike anything she'd ever known flooded through Deborah. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." Ranger stood, sweeping her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their promise. When they separated, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a ring, a simple gold band set with a small diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "I've been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment." The ring fit perfectly, glinting in the moonlight like a star brought down to earth. Deborah stared at it in wonder, then back at the man who had changed her life so completely in the space of a month. "When?" she asked, not needing to elaborate. "As soon as you wish," Ranger replied. "Though I suppose we should wait until your mother can travel from Boston." Deborah nodded, suddenly eager to share her happiness with her family. "I'll write to her tomorrow, and I'd like a spring wedding if that's all right, when the wildflowers are blooming." "Spring it is," he agreed, kissing her once more before reluctantly bidding her good night. As Deborah watched him walk away, her hand resting over her heart where his ring now lay against her skin, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here. What had begun in terror, being dragged into the woods by dangerous men, had led to the greatest joy she'd ever known. The path had been perilous, but the destination was worth every step. The news of their engagement spread through Concord like wildfire. By noon the next day, Deborah had received no fewer than 15 visitors, all bearing congratulations and in most cases casseroles or pies for the future Mrs. Holloway. The school board expressed concerns about losing their teacher so soon after hiring her, but Deborah assured them she intended to finish out the school year. "After that," she added with a smile, "perhaps we can discuss the possibility of married teachers." Ranger rode to San Francisco to send a telegraph to Deborah's mother, inviting her and Deborah's brother to visit as soon as possible. The response came a week later. They would arrive by train in early November, eager to meet the man who had captured Deborah's heart. As autumn deepened into winter, Deborah and Ranger settled into a rhythm of work and courtship. She taught during the day while he managed the ranch. Evenings and weekends were devoted to each other. They made plans for their future, where they would live, the ranch house, with additions for a growing family. How they would balance her teaching with his ranching, with compromise and communication, and how many children they hoped for, "as many as God sees fit to bless us with," Ranger had said, making Deborah blush. November brought Eleanor and Thomas Gray to Concord. Deborah's reunion with her mother and 17-year-old brother was tearful and joyous. Eleanor, a handsome woman in her 40s with the same chestnut hair as her daughter, embraced Deborah tightly. "Let me look at you," she said, holding Deborah at arm's length. "You're glowing, my dear." Thomas, gangly and in the awkward stage between boy and man, was more reserved but no less pleased to see his sister. "Boston's dull without you, Deb," he admitted. Their first meeting with Ranger was slightly tense, with Eleanor clearly reserving judgment on the man who had won her daughter's heart so quickly. But as days passed and she witnessed the obvious love between them, her initial skepticism gave way to approval. "He's a good man," she told Deborah one evening as they prepared dinner in the schoolhouse kitchen. "Not what I imagined for you, but perhaps better than anything I could have chosen." "I love him, Mother," Deborah said simply. Eleanor smiled, patting her daughter's cheek. "I can see that. And more importantly, he loves you not just with words, but with actions. A mother couldn't ask for more." Thomas, meanwhile, was thoroughly enchanted by the ranch. He followed Ranger everywhere, asking endless questions about cattle, horses, and the business of ranching. To Deborah's delight, Ranger showed infinite patience with the boy, treating him like a younger brother rather than an annoyance. "Your brother has a natural way with horses," Ranger commented one Sunday after church. He might make a fine rancher someday. Are you offering him a job?" Deborah teased. "Actually, I am. If your mother agrees, he could come work for me after he finishes school, learn the business from the ground up." The idea took root, and by the time the Grays prepared to return to Boston in December, it was settled that Thomas would return to Concord after completing his schooling the following spring. "Perhaps I'll join him," Eleanor said thoughtfully as they stood on the train platform for farewells. "Boston holds too many memories now, and I find I quite like California." She hugged Ranger warmly. "Take care of my daughter until I return for the wedding." "With my life," he promised solemnly. Winter in the foothills was milder than Deborah had expected after Boston's harsh seasons, but it brought its own challenges. Heavy rains turned roads to mud, making travel difficult. Several times, Ranger was unable to visit for days due to flooded creeks between the ranch and town. During one such separation, a winter storm blew in from the Pacific, bringing torrential downpours that lasted 3 days. On the fourth morning, Deborah woke to sunshine and a knock at her door. Ranger stood on her porch, soaked to the skin but grinning. "Missed you," he said simply. "You rode through the storm?" she asked, ushering him inside despite propriety's dictates against unchaperoned visits. "Waited until it broke this morning, but the creek's still high. Had to swim thunder across." Deborah shook her head, torn between exasperation and love. "You could have drowned." "Worth the risk," he replied, pulling her into his arms despite his wet clothes. "Couldn't wait another day to see you." As winter gave way to spring, wedding preparations began in earnest. Eleanor returned to Concord in March, bringing Thomas and trunks full of linens, china, and wedding finery from Boston. She and Mrs. Peterson formed an immediate alliance, taking charge of arrangements with cheerful efficiency. April arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the hills, just as Deborah had hoped. The wedding date was set for the last Saturday of the month, with the ceremony to take place in Concord's small church, followed by a celebration at the Diamond H Ranch. The night before the wedding, Deborah found herself unable to sleep. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her mother, who was sharing the small quarters with her, and sat by the window. The moon was full, casting silver light over the schoolyard and the hills beyond. Tomorrow she would become Deborah Holloway. The thought filled her with joy and a strange nostalgia for the life she was leaving behind. Not that she regretted her decision, far from it. But change, even wonderful change, brought its own kind of bittersweetness. A soft knock at her door startled her. Opening it cautiously, she found Ranger standing there as if her thoughts had summoned him. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Needed to see you." Despite her protest, Deborah stepped outside, pulling her shawl tighter around her nightdress. The night air was cool but not cold, fragrant with the scent of spring blossoms. "Having second thoughts?" Ranger asked, only half joking. "Not a single one," she assured him. "Just reflecting." So much has happened since that day on the stagecoach. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago and sometimes like yesterday, he nodded, taking her hands. "I was thinking about that too, how differently things might have turned out, if you hadn't tracked us, if you hadn't been so brave." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, bound by shared memories and the promise of a shared future. "I brought you something," Ranger said finally, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small leather pouch and placed it in her hand. A wedding gift. Inside the pouch, Deborah found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When she opened it, she gasped at the miniature portraits inside, her parents on one side, Ranger's on the other. "How did you?" "Your mother had the daguerreotype of your parents. For mine, I had to send to Virginia." "My aunt still had one." Tears filled Deborah's eyes as she looked up at him. "It's perfect, thank you." Ranger clasped the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering at the nape. "I wanted you to have all your family with you tomorrow. Those who can be there in person, and those who can only be there in spirit." Overcome with emotion, Deborah stood on tiptoe to kiss him, decorum forgotten in the depth of her feelings. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "More than I have words to say." "Show me tomorrow," he replied softly, "and every day after." With one last kiss, he left her, disappearing into the moonlit night like a figure from a dream. Deborah returned to bed, the locket warm against her skin, and finally slept, dreaming of the life that awaited her. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union. The church was filled to capacity with townspeople, ranch hands, and students, all eager to witness the marriage of the schoolteacher and the rancher whose story had become local legend. Deborah wore a gown of ivory satin and lace that a leaner had brought from Boston, simple by Eastern standards but elegant nonetheless. Her chestnut hair was adorned with a crown of wildflowers, and around her neck hung Ranger's locket, a tangible connection to both their pasts. When the church doors opened and she began her walk down the aisle on Thomas's arm, Deborah saw only Ranger. He stood tall and straight at the altar, his expression transforming from solemnity to wonder as he watched her approach. The service was brief but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves. As they exchanged rings, his a plain gold band to match hers, Deborah felt a sense of completion, as if the final piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Ranger's kiss was gentle but full of promise, a beginning rather than an end. The church erupted in applause as they turned to face their community as Mr. and Mrs. Holloway. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening, with food, music, dancing, and more goodwill than Deborah had ever experienced in one place. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating a magical glow that reflected the joy she felt inside. "Happy, Mrs. Holloway?" Ranger asked as they swayed together in a quiet corner, the party continuing around them. "Completely," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." He drew back slightly to look into her eyes. "I was lost after Rebecca died. Functioning, but not really living. Then you came crashing into my life, or rather, I crashed into yours and everything changed." "For me too," Deborah said softly. "I came west looking for purpose, for a new beginning. I found so much more." Later, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the ranch house that was now their home, Ranger led Deborah to the porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. "Look," he said, pointing to the hills where they had once fled for their lives. In the moonlight, they appeared peaceful, benign. "Hard to believe what happened there. Perhaps that's why we appreciate this so much," Deborah suggested, leaning into his embrace. "Because we know how quickly it can all change," Ranger nodded, his arms tightening around her. "I promise you, Deborah Holloway, that whatever comes good or bad, we'll face it together." "Together," she echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss. Spring became summer, summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to winter. Their first year of marriage brought changes both expected and surprising. Deborah continued teaching, riding to and from the schoolhouse on a gentle mare Ranger had trained especially for her. On weekends and during school breaks, she threw herself into ranch life, learning to garden, preserve food, and even help with calving when necessary. Ranger expanded the ranch, adding 200 acres and increasing his herd. With Thomas now working as his apprentice, he had more time to focus on breeding better stock and improving the property. He built a larger barn, added rooms to the main house, and constructed a special library for Deborah's growing collection of books. Their happiness was complete when, in early spring of their second year of marriage, Deborah discovered she was expecting a child. The news was met with jubilation from both families. Eleanor had decided to stay in California permanently and had opened a small dressmaking shop in Concord, while Thomas had become an indispensable part of the ranch operation. "A baby," Ranger marveled, his hand gentle on Deborah's still flat stomach. "Our own family growing. Are you hoping for a boy or girl?" Deborah asked. "Healthy," he replied immediately. "That's all that matters." After a pause, he added with a grin, "Though a little girl with your eyes would be pretty special." As Deborah's pregnancy progressed, she cut back on her teaching duties but refused to give them up entirely. "The baby won't come until November," she told Ranger when he suggested she rest more. "And I'm perfectly capable of teaching children while creating one." Her stubbornness both exasperated and amused him. "You're the most determined woman I've ever known," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Our child will certainly never lack for strength of character. With your courage and my determination, this child will be unstoppable, Deborah agreed, leaning against his shoulder. On a crisp November morning, after a labor that tested even Deborah's renowned determination, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made Dr. Wilson chuckle. "Strong lungs," the doctor commented as he handed the swaddled infant to Ranger. "Takes after his mother." Looking down at the tiny red face of his son, Ranger felt a love so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully transferring the baby to Deborah's waiting arms. "Hello, Robert Thomas Holloway," she murmured, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We've been waiting for you." They had chosen to name their son after both their fathers, Robert for Ranger's father and Thomas for Deborah's. It seemed fitting, a bridge between past and future. As winter settled over the Diamond H Ranch, the new family of three established their own rhythms and traditions. Deborah took a temporary leave from teaching to focus on motherhood, though she continued to tutor several advanced students at home. Ranger adjusted his work schedule to spend more time with his wife and son, delegating more responsibility to Thomas and his foreman. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, they gathered in the parlor with Alina and Thomas to celebrate their first Christmas as a family. Baby Robert, now 6 weeks old, slept peacefully in a cradle Ranger had crafted himself, unaware of the adoring glances cast his way by his parents and grandmother. "Best Christmas gift I've ever received," Ranger said, his arm around Deborah as they watched their son sleep. "Better than that rifle last year," she teased. "Much better," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Though I'm still rather fond of that rifle." They all laughed, the sound mingling with the pop of the fire and the soft whistle of wind outside the windows. In that moment of perfect contentment, Deborah thought back to the terrifying day when her stagecoach had been attacked and she'd been dragged into the woods by dangerous men. Had someone told her then that those events would lead to this life, this love, this family, this happiness, she would never have believed them. Yet here she was, surrounded by love in a home she had helped build, with a husband who cherished her and a son who represented all their hopes for the future. The path had been unexpected and at times frightening, but the destination was more beautiful than she could have imagined. Ranger seemed to read her thoughts, as he often did. "No regrets?" he asked softly, just for her ears. Deborah smiled up at the man who had tracked her through wilderness and danger, the man who had brought her home in more ways than one. Not a single one. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ranch in a blanket of white that promised renewal and growth when spring returned. Inside, warmed by fire and family, Deborah and Ranger held each other close, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and excited for the adventures still to come. For in the Wild West, where danger and opportunity walked hand in hand, they had found something rare and precious, a love strong enough to withstand any challenge, a bond forged in fire and tempered by devotion. It was a love story written in courage and determination, a testament to the hearts that beat beneath the untamed landscape of the American frontier. And as they looked toward the future, bright with promise and possibility, they did so together, forever grateful for the twist of fate that had turned peril into the greatest blessing of their lives.